Hello. In this video, we'll explore the year without a summer, when a massive volcanic eruption changed the world's weather, caused hunger and hardship, and reshaped history in surprising ways. In 1816, the world experienced a year without summer. Snow fell in June, crops failed, skies turned strange colors. In parts of Europe and North America, people woke to cold mornings that felt more like winter than harvest season. Families who depended on the land watched their fields die under frost. Hunger spread, fear spread faster, and all of it was caused not by war, but by a volcano on the other side of the world. That is one of history's most astonishing facts. In April of 1815, Mount Tambora in present-day Indonesia erupted with such force that it changed the global climate, darkened skies, and helped create one of the most miserable years in modern history. To understand just how extraordinary this was, we need to begin with Tambora itself. Before the eruption, Mount Tambora stood as a massive stratovolcano on the island of Sumbawa. It had likely been building pressure for centuries. Then, in April 1815, that pressure was released in a catastrophic explosion. The eruption was so powerful that it is ranked among the largest in recorded human history. Entire villages near the volcano were destroyed almost instantly by pyroclastic flows, ash, and fire. The sound of the blast was heard across huge distances. In some regions, people mistook it for cannon fire and believed a naval battle had begun. The destruction near the volcano was immediate and horrifying. Ash fell thick across the surrounding islands. Water sources were contaminated. Farmland was buried. Tsunamis struck coastlines. Tens of thousands of people died either directly from the eruption or in the famine and disease that followed. Yet the full scale of Tambora's impact could not be seen from the ground in those first days. The eruption launched enormous quantities of ash and sulfur-rich gases high into the atmosphere. There, they spread across the globe, forming a veil that reflected sunlight away from the Earth. The result was a measurable drop in global temperatures. And that is where this story becomes truly remarkable. A volcano in Indonesia did not just devastate nearby communities, it altered weather patterns across continents. By 1816, people in Europe, North America, and elsewhere were living through the consequences without fully understanding the cause. In New England, frost struck in June, July, and even August in some places. Crops withered, corn failed. Farmers who had planted with hope watched entire seasons collapse. In Europe, relentless cold and rain ruined harvests and worsened already fragile food supplies after years of war. This was a world already exhausted. The Napoleonic Wars had only recently ended. Economies were unstable. Populations were vulnerable. Transportation was limited, and food could not easily be moved to where it was needed most. When harvests failed, there were few safety nets. Bread prices rose, oats became expensive, livestock suffered. People sold possessions, left home, or simply went hungry. In some areas, famine conditions developed. Begging increased, theft rose, social tensions sharpened. Nature had delivered a shock to a society that was already bruised and fragile. Imagine being a farmer in 1816 with no knowledge of atmospheric science, no satellite images, and no global news system. You wake in June expecting warmth, and instead you find your fields glazed in frost. Days later, it snows. Not a light dusting in the high mountains, but snow where summer should be underway. Your crops blacken. Your animals need feed you may not have. The future narrows quickly. One bad season can be survived. But when the weather stays wrong week after week, fear becomes a daily companion. You do not know that the cause lies thousands of miles away in volcanic debris circling the planet. You only know that the seasons no longer behave as they should. In New England, many families responded by moving westward in search of better land and more stable conditions. The failed harvests of 1816 helped accelerate migration into parts of the American interior. In this way, climate shock shaped not only suffering in the present, but movement in the future. Weather influenced settlement patterns. Desperation redirected lives. This is one of the most important truths in environmental history. Natural events do not remain natural for long. They become economic crises, migration stories, political pressure points, and deeply personal tragedies. Europe suffered intensely as well. In parts of Switzerland, Germany, and France, The cold and rain caused repeated crop failures. Food became scarce and expensive. Malnutrition spread. Riots broke out in some places as hungry populations demanded relief. Grain shortages fed unrest. Disease often followed hunger because weakened people are more vulnerable to infection. Typhus and other illnesses found easy victims among the poor. The year without a summer was not just a weather anomaly, it was a humanitarian disaster. The skies themselves seemed to have carried a sense of unease. Contemporary observers described unusual sunsets, vivid, strange, sometimes beautiful, in a way that felt unnatural. The volcanic particles in the atmosphere changed the quality of light. Artists later captured some of these dramatic skies in paintings. The world looked different, and for many people it must have felt different too, as if nature had slipped slightly off its axis. In a time when many still interpreted unusual natural events through religious or supernatural frameworks, these atmospheric changes could feel like warnings. One of the most famous cultural consequences of this dark and cold year took place beside Lake Geneva. In 1816, a group of writers and intellectuals, including Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Godwin, who would later become Mary Shelley, and John Polidori, spent time indoors because the weather was so miserable. Confined by endless rain and gloom, they entertained themselves by telling ghost stories. Out of that atmosphere of darkness and uneasy imagination came one of literature's greatest works, Frankenstein. Think about that for a moment. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia helped create the conditions that contributed to the writing of a novel that still shapes horror and science fiction today. That detail matters because it shows that history is not divided into neat categories like nature, politics, and art. They constantly collide. Tambora did not just lower temperatures. It influenced migration, agriculture, hunger, public disorder, disease, and culture. It reached into the private lives of writers and into the economic survival of farmers. It touched the dinner table, the marketplace, and the imagination. The eruption is a reminder that a single natural event can ripple outward through every layer of society. Scientists today understand much more clearly how eruptions like Tambora affect climate. Sulfur dioxide released into the stratosphere forms sulfate aerosols, which reflect incoming sunlight. This can cool the Earth's surface for months or even years depending on the scale of the eruption. Tambora was large enough to produce a significant global effect. Modern climate science allows us to reconstruct these patterns using ice cores, tree rings, written records, and atmospheric modeling. But for the people living through 1816, there was no such framework. They experienced the symptoms without seeing the system. That gap between experience and explanation is part of what makes the story so powerful. We often assume that when disaster strikes, people know what is happening. In reality, many historical societies had to endure catastrophe before they could even name it. The people of 1816 could describe freezing mornings, failed crops, and empty granaries. They could not yet connect those events to volcanic aerosols in the upper atmosphere. They were trapped inside a mystery while paying the price for it in real time. And this is where the story becomes more than just a dramatic historical episode. It becomes a lesson in interconnectedness. The Earth is a system in which events in one place can produce consequences in another on a massive scale. Tambora showed that in the 19th century, with terrifying clarity. A mountain exploded in Southeast Asia, and a family in Vermont lost its corn. A village in Europe faced bread riots. Writers in Switzerland sat under dark skies and imagined monsters. The chain of cause and effect was invisible to those living it. But from our perspective, it is one of the clearest examples of global interdependence in history. There is also a humbling lesson here about human vulnerability. We often speak as if industrial progress gave us command over nature. Yet even today, major eruptions can disrupt air travel, agriculture, and climate. In 1816, societies were even more exposed. A cold summer could become a famine. A failed oat crop could cripple transportation because horses depended on feed. Food prices could rise quickly enough to destabilize entire communities. Nature did not need years to transform daily life. It only needed one eruption and one broken season. The phrase, "year without a summer," sounds almost poetic at first, but the reality was brutal. It meant hunger where there should have been harvest. It meant uncertainty where routine should have been. It meant parents trying to explain to children why the world outside no longer matched the calendar. It meant hard choices, whether to stay or leave, whether to sell tools or livestock, whether to save seed for next year, or eat it now to survive. These are the quiet tragedies that often vanish behind the larger headline of climatic anomaly. And yet, the story endures precisely because it feels so modern. Today, we live in a world increasingly aware of climate systems, global vulnerability, and the social consequences of environmental disruption. Tambora reminds us that climate shocks are not abstract scientific events. They are lived experiences. They determine who eats, who migrates, who falls ill, who panics, and who adapts. They expose the strengths and weaknesses of societies. They also reveal how quickly normal life can unravel when the environment shifts unexpectedly. By the end of 1816, the world had not ended, but many lives had been permanently changed. Some families relocated and never returned. Some communities recovered slowly, some never fully did. The skies eventually cleared. Temperatures stabilized, harvests improved, but the memory of that terrible year remained. It survived in letters, diaries, official reports, paintings, and literature. It survived in the movements of people across maps and in the warnings passed down through generations. History remembers not only the eruption, but the season when summer disappeared. So, when we look back at the year without a summer, we are not just looking at strange weather. We are looking at a global chain reaction. Volcanic fire, atmospheric haze, cold fields, empty kitchens, crowded roads, restless cities, and stories born in candlelight. It is one of those rare historical episodes that makes the world feel at once vast and tightly connected. One mountain changed the rhythm of life for millions who would never hear its name. And perhaps that is the most gripping fact of all. History is not always driven by emperors and armies. Sometimes it is driven by ash in the sky. Sometimes the event that changes lives across continents begins in silence deep beneath the earth, building pressure for centuries before erupting in a matter of days. Then the consequences travel farther than anyone can imagine, entering farms, homes, markets, and books. If this story tells us anything, it is that human history and natural history are inseparable. We build civilizations as if the ground beneath us is steady, and the seasons ahead are guaranteed. But the year without a summer reminds us that stability can be interrupted, and when it is, the effects move through every part of society. That is why the story of Tambora still matters. It is dramatic, tragic, and unforgettable, but it is also deeply relevant because it shows how fragile the line can be between ordinary life and global disruption. So, the next time you think of history as dates and battles alone, remember 1816. Remember the frost in June, the failed harvests, the hungry families, the darkened skies, and the novel born from a stormy summer that never arrived. Remember that one eruption on one island changed the world's weather and reshaped lives far beyond the horizon. Sometimes the most powerful force in history is not a ruler or a revolution. Sometimes it is a volcano and the cold shadow it casts across the world. Thanks for watching. If this story surprised you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next journey into history's strangest and most unforgettable moments.